Recently, I've hosted a bunch of discussions about P.M. Formey's book, Choosing Civility, subtitled The 25 Rules of Considerate Conduct. And he proposes that civility is about relationships. It's about how we treat each other. It's about our individual connection to each other and the individual's connection to the greater social whole. That's what he says civility primarily is. It's mainly about the interpersonal world, how we, like today, treat each other, interact with each other, friends and strangers. But it's more than just you and me. It's really about the whole network of relationships that we weave, this garden that we tend to try to bring relationships into full bloom. It invigorates our communities. It makes them real communities. It arises naturally from our animal nature. It can be honed through teaching and instruction and practice. And it weaves the social fabric. In fact, civility itself is linked to the term civic, the idea of being a citizen, whether that's a citizen of a community or a city or a state or the planet, like the idea of a global citizen. So it's validly used both in the personal and in the civic realm. It's about being good citizens and being about good friends. So, is it always good? No. It's only good in my mind when it builds respectful, ethical, interpersonal relationships. I don't think it's good when it stands in the way of beneficence or compassion or justice. Usually, ethically used, civility is good for all of us, for me, for you, in our society. So I hope in my exploration today I'm going to encourage all of us, myself included, to try to do a better job of nurturing civility so that we can have a more just and equitable world. That's my goal. I'm going to focus the lion's share of my talk on the interpersonal because I think that's the best part of Forney's book, actually. And his very first rule is a really important one that I often bring up in different ways, and that is pay attention. Pay attention. He reminds us to be mindful, to be open to each other, to listen, not just occasionally, but as a habit, as a way of living. He writes, being civil means being constantly aware of others and weaving restraint, respect, and consideration into the very fabric of this awareness. Now, I'll admit, being constantly aware of others is probably impossible or healthy. That sometimes we need to retreat, turn inwards, whether that's through meditation or yoga, beautiful music, a silent solo walk in the woods. And sometimes in life, those sorts of personal times are necessary to bring out our best to the world. It's just good self-care, and it lets us care for others. Nevertheless, I think Forney's right when he says that civility is awareness that no human encounter is without consequence. The smallest meeting can have great consequence. Like the act of listening, which you sometimes don't think is an act. But it can be very positive, especially when you listen actively, not just passively. When you really listen to somebody, engaged listening can be an expression of your values. Forney says, when we find the strength to engage in considerate listening, we are in fact expressing ourselves. And for somebody who speaks for a living, I need to listen to that more. When you really listen, you don't space out to each other. You actually look at the person, you smile, you make respectful eye contact, you nod when appropriate, you ask open-ended questions like, how did that make you feel? Or can you tell me more? But it cannot be formulaic. It's got to be about the particular person in front of you. Call them by their name. It shows that they matter. Now, giving attention to others honors their inherent worth, their unique inherent worth, which is civil and a core value of ethical culture. When we come to ethical societies, we recommit ourselves to treating every person as being of inherent worth. Worth that is rooted in their very particular, irreplaceable, and unique existence. Whenever we're with another person, we have to remind ourselves that there has never been and will never be another person just like them. That, to me, is as close as we get to a sacred, humanistic awareness. Now, ethical culture has a golden rule, and it's about the uniqueness of every person. We don't say, as one of the many versions of the golden rule says, that we should treat others as we should be treated, because that's a little bit too self-referential. What if they don't want to be treated like we want to be treated, right? So we should instead respond to the particularity of the other person. And through personal relationships, we can help each other grow and develop our unique capacities. Through relationships, we bring out the best in others. And Forney basically says that when he says the golden rule tells us how to treat each other justly, but because it hinges upon the subjective, it's not always totally reliable. We should learn to respect others on their own terms as well. So when I welcome people to the Ethical Society, I hope I am welcoming them on their own terms. Those who come to societies usually share our values, if they've done their research, because we do stand for something. They want to try to treat people with worth and make the world a better place. But we also encourage visitors and new members to be themselves. And being civil requires a welcoming and mutual acceptance. And such acceptance is much better done when we believe in the best of each other. If we try to relate to each other through love and kindness. It seems simple, overstated, trite, but very little is as effective as kindness. Henry James gave great advice when he said, 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. The third is to be kind. It actually surprised me that, being a foreigner, that Forney said that we do that very well in the United States. He praises idealism and radical fairness of the American soul. He says he appreciates our unbounded willingness to take a chance on others. And at a time when our country seems to be increasingly a pariah on the national stage, that's nice to hear. Linked to the respect for others is a respect for ourselves, something I touched on a couple of weeks ago. Because living a good life and bringing out the best of others should not include putting ourselves down. Too often, we treat respect as if it's a scarce resource, when in fact, respect builds respect. If you respect yourself, you usually respect others. As I spoke about a couple of weeks ago, self-hate infects not only the thinker, but the person they're relating to. Forney wrote, sometimes it is dissatisfaction with ourselves that makes us judge others unfairly. We sort of transfer that negativeness into the whole world and everybody around us. So self-respect is important to treat others with respect. Both Forney and the ethical culture tradition reflect some of the perspective of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, which the guy who founded this place studied intensely. Kant said, in so many words, never treat people as a means to an end, but treat them only as an end in themselves. Treat other people as irreplaceable and sacred. Treat yourself the same way. He encourages us to, quote, be civil without self-effacement, to be sensitive and assertive, to practice respect for others as an extension of self-respect. So civility is in our own self-interest. It's not just for others. Too often, people incorrectly assume that civility restricts us only and forces us to live inauthentic lives. A recent ABC questionnaire that Forney mentions in his book worded a question this way: do you think it's better for people to have good manners, even if it means hiding what they really think? Now, the framing of that question is one of the problems in our society. It's possible, after all, to say what you believe and be civil at the same time. He writes, "It is possible to be civil and true to one's belief. It doesn't have to stifle self-expression. We can choose to express one part of ourselves rather than the other." So civility and manners don't have to be burdens. They can be tools to living a good life. People misunderstand civility when they think that all it is rigid, outdated manners. Politeness that no longer serves us. And in our fast-moving culture, we often tend to disparage traditional ways. Forney says, since change is good, says conventional wisdom, then following conventional rules can't be good. Therefore, civility must be bad. So there's a lot of disparaging of civility because it's seen as just about being the old rules. But Forney's from a long tradition of philosophers like Aristotle and J.S. Mill, who actually appreciate that civility helps us live more fulfilling lives because it helps us develop virtues that are useful, like self-control or restraint or moderation. Aristotle thought that individuals flourish more, have better lives, that they say they're happier when they learn the art of moderation. And that only happens when you're taught it and you practice it in your life. So in that ways, the virtues underlying civility can be of value to you as an individual. I mean, that's something that parents know well. We don't teach our children manners because we want them to be constricted. We teach them manners because we believe it will help them be happier. It'll help them flourish. It'll help them be part of a community. Civility can develop self-control. It can guide our passions a little bit more effectively. He writes, restraint is an infusion of thinking, of thoughtfulness, into everything we do. We choose that behavior, although it may not seem the most gratifying now, because it will make us feel good in 5 minutes from now, or tomorrow, or next year. Restraint is the art of feeling good later. I love that idea. Few people want to be around somebody who has no restraint. They don't want to be around somebody who only wants pleasure and can't pay attention to the future or to other people there. So manners can help us be well-liked and welcomed into groups and can give us greater control. Forney concludes, civility is liberating. It frees us from slavery to self-absorption, impulse, and mood. It frees us from slavery to self-absorption, impulse, and mood. So I think it probably helps us survive. I bet there are some evolutionary roots to civility. It developed because we're social creatures. If we were animals who just lived solitary lives, like bears or leopards, we wouldn't need civility, but we're social creatures. We empathize with each other. We're drawn to each other into groups. Some joys can be found in solitude. I'm going to talk about that next month. But most people just enjoy company. I liked Forney's book, or parts of it, because it shares ethical culture's emphasis on interpersonal relationships. He said, I am convinced that to a certain extent, life is what our relationships make it. Good relationships make our lives good. Bad relationships make our lives bad. That seems pretty clear to me. So without reaching beyond narrow concerns and bodily desires, it would be hard for us to have relationships. It would be hard for us to develop self-esteem. Self-worth is so dependent on being part of something greater than ourselves. Finding a balance between autonomy and connection is needed. so that we can live lives with integrity in social groups. Civility molds compassion and social habits that help us operate smoothly in groups. And we need more of that today in our fractious, contentious, and difficult times. But I'd like now to shift to how civility can be unethically used. It can be used to maintain power. It can be used to maintain privilege and patriarchy. It can repress demands for justice. And I'm going to explain this giving two historical examples. I'm going to start with the Civil Rights Movement. Now, some describe the Civil Rights Movement as really civil. They describe the practitioners of nonviolence as polite people who merely sat in the front of the bus or sat at a segregated lunch counter. And while it's true that many of the civil rights heroes openly, stoically suffered violence at the hands of people without striking back, this narrative offers only partial truth. First of all, those who resisted the civil rights movement didn't label the civil rights protesters as being civil. Freedom riders were called troublemakers and beat up for stirring up trouble. Authorities in Birmingham sent dogs on people because they threatened Southern civility. And I'm sure nothing seems so uncivil to a Klansman as the marriage between Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter, one white, one black. Oppressors often think they are maintaining civil peace in a civil manner. In addition, it would be a mistake to think that the civil rights movement only consisted of nonviolence. There was a rigorous agitation that verged on revolution in this country. And I'm convinced that if it weren't for the threat posed by the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, Kwame Ture, and Black Panthers, if it wasn't for the threat that they posed to the status quo, the civil rights movement wouldn't have worked so well. Liberal political forces aligned themselves with Martin Luther King and the more moderate side of the civil rights movement because it was less frightening than the alternative. They began to see how radical King actually was, and that was the time that he was assassinated. To understand a little bit more of what I'm getting at, I urge you to read the article that's out on the table by Thomas Segre, sent by the subcommittee of the task force, White America's Age-Old Misguided Obsession with Civility. The second example I want to offer is a little bit more raw for me and many of you here. It surrounds the Kavanaugh hearings. Now, Monica Hess of the Washington Post captured my reaction so accurately that I'm going to quote her in length here. And her article is also available. She writes, "If you're like me, streaming 22 hours straight of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, you might have noticed something. It was often presented not so much as a fight between liberalism and conservatism, or even constitutional originalism versus activism, but as a fight between hysteria and civility. Civil, a parade of senators at stopwatch 30 minutes a pop questioning the Supreme Court nominee about hot-button matters, including abortion. Hysterical, a parade of protesters, mostly women, some men, interrupting the civility at the top of their lungs before being removed by Capitol Police. Protect women, be a hero. Our bodies, our choice. Women's rights are human rights. And the most dramatic, I will die." The interruptions were a nuisance to some members of Congress, both on the committee and outside the room. "What's the hysteria coming from?" asked Ben Sasse, senator, lamenting the long tradition of screaming protesters saying that women are going to die. On Facebook, Representative Peter King was more forceful. "The disruptive, hysterical outbursts and demonstrations at yesterday's Senate confirmation were absolutely disgraceful." Now, to Hess, civility is a nostalgic buzzword, and hysteria, a pejorative characteristic of overly emotional women. But as she points out, there's nothing particularly civil about taking away people's rights to bodily autonomy. And there's nothing particularly hysterical about wanting to keep those rights. And then this hits at the heart of the problem, about the misuse of the word civility. In a country currently in frequent tailspin, it's easy to see manners as a refuge, instead of what they sometimes are, the pretty veneer covering a crumbled foundation, or a reassuring sleight of hand, or a distraction from issues that are necessarily messy and emotional. She concludes, civility is nice, but when it's used to obfuscate actual beliefs and acts, it's useless. Interpersonally, in most circumstances, I still think civility is crucial. In promoting civil behavior, interpersonally, here at the Ethical Society, I don't want civility, however, to get in the way of justice. So how do we do that? In politics, which has gotten very messy and emotional, how do we best move forward? To me, the key is inclusion. Inclusion. Let me explain. A broad swath of people must be included in the civil conversation, in particularly people historically without power and privilege. They have to be included in civil conversations and public policy. We have to work to spread power, economic power through job training, employment opportunities, better wages, political power by assuring that people can vote in meaningful elections. Too often our discussions of civility occur in settings where people with the least power and the most problems are excluded. For 400 years, slaves and their descendants have been denied a proportional political voice. For longer than that, women have had unequal pay and unequal power. And until the political revolution to make democracy work for all is realized, I caution us to think very carefully about what civility means. Interpersonally, in this building, even in this city, I think civility means giving space to others to be their authentic selves. It means being hospitable and inviting, remaining silent when others gather their thoughts and try to share their feelings and needs and hopes and dreams. By being silent and letting others speak, we honor them. Forney puts it this way: silence is not necessarily a sign of a failure to communicate. Instead, it can be the refreshing result of a choice. When people bemoan the good old days and how we don't have them anymore, they're usually expressing their discomfort at having to think in new and different ways. I do that sometimes. But that's what real inclusion requires. It's also what real justice requires. Hearing new voices are going to challenge us. They're going to challenge the system. The rules we've previously lived by, the rules of civility, have to be rethought. They have to evolve. We have to be willing to step back, hear other people, and re-examine how we have built our civil society and how we're going to build it in the future. We have to constantly reconsider what we say is civil. We need to measure how it values the worth of every person, how it nurtures ethical relationships, and how it builds justice. This is a re-education. It's not a threat, it's an opportunity. As I said before, what might seem an inconvenience or a restraint can turn out to be the key to our liberation. The civility of inclusion, the civility of justice, opens us to broader horizons. It opens us to the gifts of others previously ignored. Ignored by outmoded ways of thinking, rigid power structures, or habit. Forney says, it's almost a duty to ourselves and others to resist at least occasionally the temptation of a well-rehearsed life. Making an effort to diversify, he says, to diversify our acquaintances and experiences and to understand that which we discover is certainly a civil thing to do. It happens to be a smart one as well. In ethical culture, we say that by bringing out the best in others, we bring out the best in ourselves. And I believe that deeply. I also believe that by bringing out the best in a more diverse group of others brings out our best in greater diverse ways. Civility, if it's left to become rigid, exclusive, may seem easy. Unquestioned traditions may feel comfortable. But rigid civility and unquestioned manners deprives us of inclusive thinking and the richness of multiculturalism and other voices. So the civility that I try to promote is a challenging civility of ever-widening circles, a civility that includes more and more perspectives. It would be easy to stay in our small circle of friends. It's easy when you're in Rome to act like Romans. But Rome is in ruins, and it's time for us to build a new community built on a real and just civility. Thank you very much.